Good morning, Dan and Amy. You heard at the top an interesting perspective from Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin. He's the chairman of the Senate Homeland Security Committee. He was sitting down for an interview with Wall Street Journal's Opinion Journal, and he said the greatest threat facing the United States is the denial of reality. And I would suggest that's what you heard from the president, from, to a certain extent, his spokes being Josh Earnest yesterday, as well as from Hillary Clinton. But so much of the coverage is wrapped up in CNN inventing things that Donald Trump didn't say. He said profiling. He didn't say racial profiling. They attributed the word racial to Trump's response. And then the tweet of one Eric Trump.
Yeah, actually, it was Donald Trump Jr.
Trump Jr.?
Yeah, late yesterday, tweeted this. It had to do with immigration. It said, if I had a bowl of Skittles and I told you just 3 would kill you, would you take a handful? And there was a picture of a bowl of Skittles. This image says it all. Let's end the politically correct agenda that doesn't put America first. And Skittles' parent company, Wrigley Americas, came out. They're not happy. Skittles are candy. They say refugees are people. And we don't feel it's an appropriate analogy.
Thank you for the clarification. It's interesting. By the way, put America first, not first American chicken, which is different. Interestingly, our next guest and friend of the show, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, I just noticed changed his Twitter handle to Son of Skittles. And I wonder why he did that. Let's talk to Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, the founder and the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Dr. Jasser, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
So, Son of Skittles, what do you mean?
Well, listen, I'm pretty hawkish in making sure we don't let the enemies of this country in, but we also have to realize that we are who we are because of our immigrant narrative. My parents escaped the Syrian regime in the mid-'60s, and we're from Aleppo, and we just have to be careful in that we can't change who we are. And I get the analogy he was making, but America was founded by immigrants, so I hope that we fought many wars from World War II to the Vietnam War by understanding that we had enemies in those areas that we were fighting militarily, but we also welcomed those refugees who shared our values. And the current immigration system is broken. There's no doubt. We're not vetting for ideology. We even just gave citizenship to 800 folks that should have been deported. So There's no doubt Mr. Trump has the right on the fact that we need extreme vetting. But let's be careful in not comparing human beings to candy.
Now, by the way, just so you know, for the record, I do know where Aleppo is, unlike Gary Johnson. So since your family's from Aleppo. Wanted to go back to that clip we had at the top from Senator Ron Johnson saying the greatest threat facing America is the denial of reality. How do you respond to that?
That's exactly true. Our current entire axis of Homeland Security is called countering violent extremism. What is that? I mean, every time we see one of these individuals, we get focused on their narrative, what was his little story, if you will, but these aren't lone wolves. We are at war, and there's a bigger ideology, which has to do with anti-Americanism, Sharia supremacism, not only the belief in ISIS, but the belief in the Islamic State over a secular state like America. And when you have Homeland Security unwilling to identify Islamism and the belief in theocratic states as preferable to America, we can't identify the precursors, and we're going to continue missing them. And yes, the family might not have known he was going to make bombs and be militant, but I guarantee you, if you look at the mosque he went to, it was the Islamic Circle of North America Mosque, which has seditious material inside it that's very anti-American and anti-Semitic. If you look at the family's grievance narrative about saying that they wanted to sue the city and the police for being anti-Muslim, and then you look at Homeland Security, where Jay Johnson just last week spoke to the largest Muslim organization and gave them a whole speech about how Muslims are suffering the same way the black community did under the Jim Crow laws. I mean, talk about hyperbole. You basically have the head of Homeland Security radicalizing our community by telling us that we have grievances rather than loving America and wanting to stand for this country that gives us freedom that nowhere else will.
Well, we have a bit of breaking news. The wife of Ahmad Rahami, according to the FBI, left the United States a few days before the attacks, and they're working with officials in Pakistan and United Arab Emirates to get access to her and ask her questions about what she knew. Is it possible that she was in on this? Because she looks pretty guilty if she fled the country a few days before the attacks.
And we're seeing this pattern from the San Bernardino couple that was actively involved together to the Orlando terrorist who had two different spouses. The initial one wasn't involved. She was actually abused, as we see domestic violence in this guy's history. There is some common patterns here, and the spouses of these individuals are knee-deep in it. We saw the terrorist cell in Paris that 3 months later committed another act. They were hiding in the community, and family members knew where they were. There's no way they could hide. And actually, similar to this guy who was on the run in Paris, they were able to flee for 3 months before they found him, and they actually committed a second act before they did. So often the family members, that's why they quickly arrested many of them until they released them to find out whether they were directly involved. Our community has a deeper problem, which is the facilitation of an us versus them mentality. It often starts in the family.
Well, the other thing that's interesting about this, just in terms of the response that Josh Earnest offered yesterday, that we mainly have a narrative challenge here with respect to ISIS. Mayor Sadiq Khan of London was doing a little goodwill tour seeking business this last week into this week in Chicago, New York. And, he's backslapping with Rahm Emanuel. He's backslapping with de Blasio in New York City. And every utterance of Donald Trump is put through this lens of Islamophobia. And here you have Sadiq Khan as the first Muslim mayor of London, who during the campaign referred to moderate Muslims as Uncle Toms. And that's just washed away. So do we have a narrative challenge or not? Are we going to hold people accountable for the rhetoric across the board or not? That's just a jarring statement. He later apologized for it, but it's tough to, unring that bell, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the problem is that the left comes to this, as the mayor of London and others, that the narrative to them is that we should be on a constant mode of apologetics, that America is to blame, that we need to be defensive, that Muslims are victims. That's the narrative that they want to exaggerate, versus the real narrative is one of freedom and liberty versus theocracy. That's the battle that we're fighting within the Muslim community. Muslim reformers that are willing to take ownership of where Islam is in its time in history, that ISIS doesn't come out of thin air. It's a natural byproduct of the Saudi regime, of the Iranian regime, these Islamic republics that are cauldrons of hundreds of millions of radical ideas, and that these are just the tip of the iceberg we're seeing on the streets of New York and San Bernardino and Paris. So at the end of the day, yes, it's a battle of narratives, but no, it's not the one that America's to blame for everything, but rather it's time for us to work with Muslim. We have a Muslim reform movement that is, we don't even tell, we're not trying to get the Islamists pushed out. We just want a seat at the table. But unfortunately, mainstream media, Homeland Security, this administration ignore us and instead cater to the Islamists and this bigotry of low expectations where we won't hold Muslims accountable to the same Western values, and we'll actually feed into their victim grievance mongering, which actually radicalizes our community.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, just to pick up on your point about what Jay Johnson said before Muslim Americans last week, boy, that actually, yours is the comparison with how the D.C. press corps and the media in this country treat Muslims as compared to how they treat blacks, the soft bigotry of low expectations, the going to the same hustlers as the mouthpieces for the black community, and now they're doing the same with the Muslim community.
Exactly. I mean, President Obama in February went to a mosque in Baltimore where they segregate men and women. Women are on another floor. Prime Minister Trudeau did the same thing last week. He went to a very fundamentalist extreme mosque where the women were upstairs, and he made a quote, "And to the sisters upstairs, I greet you and respect your tradition." I mean, it was just absurdly bigoted. He is a feminist a leader of Canada who claims to be a feminist, talked about women as objects, basically in a derogatory way, because he wanted to respect the traditions of that mosque, which is just offensive. why we aren't held to the same traditions and values that he holds Christians and others. And our president does the same thing, and it's happening globally.
All right, so we mentioned briefly about the family's lawsuit, their grievance that they were being, discriminated against because they're Muslim, because they wanted their first American fried chicken place to be open, 24 hours, and people in the neighborhood complained. Is it possibility that this is just that, a family grievance, instead of him being motivated by the Taliban?
Absolutely not. I mean, now, I don't want to delegitimize certain grievances that Muslims may have. Absolutely, there's some of that out there. The problem is when the bandwidth of our community gets soaked up by these grievances and you ignore the support of the Taliban, you ignore the primary center of their universe, which is a supremacism of a state that hates America. Look at the Omar Mateen in Orlando. His father was an open Taliban supporter who gave out videos, posted videos of being the president and anti-Americanism, et cetera. That should have been on the radar of Homeland Security, but it wasn't. That's what we should be focusing on, not obsessing on the grievance narrative.
One of the other narratives that's interesting to me is the genocide that's occurring in Syria and the Middle East of Christians. And it was interesting that Amal Clooney, who is George Clooney's wife, and she's also a human rights lawyer. She's got an interesting array of clients, including Julian Assange. But she was before the UN to introduce a client of hers, Nadia Murad, a young Yazidi woman whose family was slaughtered by ISIS and who escaped sex slavery. And she, who is a otherwise big proponent of world government, said she is, quote, ashamed as a supporter of the UN. One of the things it seems to me is a recognition, and this would be a great opportunity for Muslim leaders as well. And I know you're someone who does this, so I'm not pointing this at you. I'm making a general comment. A recognition of the genocide that is going on of Christians in the Middle East and the demand that more attention be paid to it and, frankly, more importantly, something be done about it.
Absolutely. And I can't tell you how important that is. In the last 10,000 refugees that came, the fact that only 47 were Christian is absolutely absurd. And the Congress finally pushed Secretary Kerry to name that a genocide. There is a genocide. And if we had been vetting correctly, we would not, for example, most statistics show 20 to 25% of refugees have sympathies for ISIS. Those should be vetted through an ideological mechanism that prevents those who don't accept our values, who believe in violent jihad, etc., not to come in. And once you clear those 20% out, you have more than enough room to accept Christians and other minorities that are suffering from a genocide, which then would allow the proportions to be fair. And there's a genocide, I call it a genocide sandwich happening in Syria, which is not only the Christians, but the Sunni majority in Syria has had over 500,000 killed by the Assad regime, which is a Alawite minority, and that's how the war started. So both communities need to be fairly treated, and history is going to show. I wrote a piece a couple weeks ago about the museum in 2045 that's going to be built about the genocide in Syria, and that's all Syrians have to look forward to, some future museum about genocide that happened to Christians and others, and unfortunately we're doing nothing about it now in real time. And they're also part of the Skittles, is the Christians and the Yazidis and others.
Yes. All right. He is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Dr. Jasser, always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.